Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 63 of the Ventures podcast. In this show, we talk a lot about different aspects of early stage venture building and venture investing. And obviously, when you're building, especially a technical product, a digital product, one of the biggest conversations is how to find and empower and pay for a technical co-founder. In fact, as you're growing a tech company, usually your engineering spend is extraordinarily expensive. And so my guest today is Josh Haas. He is the co-founder and CEO of Bubble. And Bubble is a no-code solution. It's an opportunity for entrepreneurs to build their tech companies on a technology platform that Josh describes really as a new programming language, as a new way, a paradigm to build web apps. And he and his company recently raised $100 million, and the vision is huge. In fact, the crux of the vision is he'd like entrepreneurs and investors to think, with regard to startups, why do you need engineers? Now, obviously, there are some companies like advanced AI, et cetera, that are going to need engineers. But right now, the state of technology, you really can use companies like Bubble to get your company off the ground, validate your business case. And so I'm super impressed with Bubble. I'm delighted that Josh was able to take some time to have this conversation with me, and I'm excited to share it with you. So if you're listening, you can also watch by visiting wclittle.com, and there I'll post more extensive show notes to different curriculum and things that Josh talks about. And if you're watching, of course, you can also listen by just searching for Ventures in your favorite podcast app. So with that, please enjoy this conversation with Josh Haas. All right, Josh, welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's great to be on here. I'm very excited.
Yeah, the audience, I know, is super interested in low code, no code, all about Bubble. I'm very excited for this episode. Would you mind just telling us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, a little bit about your journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm the founder of Bubble. My name is Josh. I got into technology at a pretty early age. I started programming in middle school. I wanted to build computer games, got into that for fun. But I didn't go down the sort of traditional CS path because I sort of saw computers as a toy, really. I like programming. I like coding. I didn't really this sounds pretty naive in retrospect, but I didn't really make the connection between programming and the major role that software plays in the economy. So I ended up majoring in philosophy. I got a job out of school at a hedge fund, sort of ended up in hedge fund middle management, and woke up one day and was like, why am I doing this? What am I doing here? So I basically just quit my job, moved to New York City, and started just working on side projects. Some of them were writing projects. Some of them I was just doing some programming stuff for fun. And I ended up sort of exploring the startup ecosystem in New York. This was back in 2010, 2011, where the New York startup ecosystem was starting to get exciting and interesting, but it also kind of still had a little bit of a small town feel to it. And sort of getting into that, I ended up sort of being recruited to be the technical co-founder for this guy who is sort of the template for many of our early Bubble customers. This guy who was a domain expert in this space that had to do with stock photography, but I didn't even know the specific problem that he was trying to solve was a problem until I met him. And he knew a ton about that, had been going super deep, had an idea for basically a better mousetrap piece of software. There's existing stuff on the market that did this kind of thing, but it was all this Windows desktop 1990s stuff, and he had an idea for a sleek web app that would just be faster and easier to use, but he didn't have any of the wherewithal to execute from a technical point of view. No best friend who was an engineer, right. No connections to VCs with lots of capital, just sort of an ordinary guy, right? And he was, just trying to network engineers to find a co-founder, we ran into each other at a point where I was just super open-minded to what I was going to do next, like just really in pure explore mode. And I really liked this guy. I was like, all right, you know what? Let's do this. Like, he seems smart. His business idea makes sense. He seems like a high integrity operator. So I put on the tech co-founder hat. We built and launched this product. Turned out he was absolutely right that there was a real business need there. We're starting to make some real money, but the money wasn't a lot, especially for two people, and we didn't really have a pathway to grow it. Like, it was never going to be the kind of business that investors would invest in. And even like bootstrapping to a lifestyle business would have been like, I think doable, but a multi-year journey. And I didn't have multiple years of savings at that point. Like, I had some savings, but I was sort of watching them going down and sort of going like, all right, like, do I want to burn my savings on this idea, given that, it's just hard to take off. So I quit. But I felt pretty bad about quitting, frankly, right? Like, he wanted to keep going. This was his baby. And I just really wanted to see this thing come to life in some way, right? And it really got me thinking, like, what if he could just drive it forward by himself, right? Like, why does he need a technical co-founder? He can say how, he can sketch out the design of this. He can say what should happen as the user interacts with it. Like, he can communicate how this should work. It's just that he doesn't know how to go from that to working code, right? And then, zooming out a little bit, like hanging out in co-working spaces in New York, meeting other entrepreneurs, I was just seeing this massive disconnect between the desire for engineering resources and the just supply of people who had the skills to execute, and the willingness to take on a startup idea or work for free or equity. And I sort of thought, like, you know what, let's build a tool for this. Like, there's no reason that if someone can articulate to the computer what they want software to behave as, there's no reason you can't build a smart enough system to translate that for the user into code rather than forcing the user to do it themselves. So it's kind of where the idea for Bubble came from. And I've now been working on Bubble for the last, I guess since 2012 now.
Wow. So then the process of starting Bubble, what was that like? Did you start cranking out code, getting early customers? Like, what was that early journey like?
Yeah. So I started writing code from day one. Because not necessarily because that was the smartest business decision, but because I kind of like think with my fingers a little bit, right?
Sure.
Like, it's very easier to like flesh it out. But I pretty quickly realized, like, this was not a single person project. So I put out the word to my friends I wanted a co-founder, and one of my friends introduced me to Emmanuel, who we just hit it off immediately from the get-go and started working on this together. And then in the early days, basically it was two activities. It was write code, and then it was go out and meet with basically the exact demographic of people I
Mm.
had already been meeting with, like non-technical aspiring startup founders. I would go to meetups, Amanda would go to meetups and just try and like, network. And we'd pitch them like, hey, we can't be your technical co-founder. We're working on this Bubble thing, but you could actually do it yourself using Bubble. And most people would get that pitch who was like, what? Right? Like, it's not what they were looking for, right? But a few people were like, all right, this is kind of interesting. And we got some early users like playing with it. And in those days, Bubble was very, very, very primitive. So the cycle would be, the user would like wake up in the morning, they would like try and build their application, around like noon, they'd hit like a wall. Then they'd hop on the phone with us. We'd sort of talk them through what they're trying to do. We'd be like, well, yeah, Bubble can't do that. So then we'd like, code the feature from like, noon to like 3. Then we call them up again. All right, here's how you do it. That was kind of like our early feature development cycle.
And both of you were writing code at the time, or how big? It was just the two of you cranking away in the early days.
Yeah, we're both doing a little bit of everything. So Emmanuel, I brought on because I thought I needed like a business person to like do the sales and marketing side of things while I did the technology side. Turns out there really wasn't any, sales and marketing at the beginning, right? Like it was just building the product and working directly with like a few customers. So he basically trained himself into a front end engineer, and he had like coded a little bit as a kid, so
Mm.
he wasn't starting from scratch. But he basically like learned JavaScript, learned CSS, and started helping me build the product. And then we both were sort of talking to customers over time. He took on like the majority of the like customer support, customer interaction piece of it. I took on the majority of like the deep technical architecture, but he was also working on product and I was also talking to customers.
So I love sort of the meta nature of the early journey, because you were essentially talking to people who needed the startup CTO, the technical co-founder. So you were trying to build a solution as their technical co-founder that enabled them to not need a technical co-founder. Is that those first few customers, like what was that even like? How did you get them to start paying money for it even?
Yeah, so I still pretty vividly remember our first paying customer. So
Mm.
we had like an initial cohort of like, let's call it 5 or 6 people, I think. And I think basically, all but one of them eventually like dropped out. Like either they couldn't figure out Bubble because it was pretty confusing back then, or their business went a different direction because when you're a super early stage startup, like there's a lot of just things that disappear, or for whatever reason, we lost most of them. But this one guy like kept persisting, and our business model from the very get go was free to build, pay when you launch.
Mm.
And we defined launch as your own domain name. That's sort of, good like line in the sand. So one day he said, I'm ready. I'm gonna hook up my own domain, and we're like, great, write us a $50 check, because of course we didn't have a payment system or anything built. So he wrote out a check for $50, gave it to us. We hooked up his domain, totally manually
Right.
to his app, and there we got a paying customer.
That's awesome. That's great. And were you building on AWS or what cloud provider? Like, how did you technically go about doing what you did?
Yeah, we were using AWS. We changed backend databases like 3 or 4 times over the course of Bubble, which mostly comes down to, frankly, my inexperience as an engineer,
Mm.
right? Like Bubble, I had like kept up coding over the years and built a number of things, but Bubble was like an order of magnitude harder and more complicated than anything I had ever built.
Right.
So in the early days, I tended to go for like the flashy, hot technology. I have gotten more and more conservative over time. Now, like I only use tech if it's like super well understood, hardened in production. But back in the day, like we were doing stuff with Firebase back when Firebase was like super super early. We
Right.
ran into like Firebase system limitations at various times, like
Nice.
outages, hard limits on what they'd let you do, like various stuff like that.
That must have been a little stressful. What web development frameworks or what tools or libraries did you choose, or did you just kind of grab whatever?
Yeah. Well, so we built it in Node, and still built in Node to this day. We built using a CoffeeScript, which we're currently in the process of getting off of because CoffeeScript ended up being an evolutionary dead end. So we're sort of moving from that to TypeScript. And then a lot of the frameworks today like didn't really exist back then. Like React didn't exist, or at least wasn't like a dominant player back when I started. So we basically rolled a lot of our own stuff from scratch. Especially because we were kind of building this meta level tool. It's sometimes hard to like work with frameworks that assume that you're trying to build a specific thing when you're trying to build the engine. So a lot of our infrastructure we just wrote ourselves.
Got it. Okay. So all right. So then you got your first paying customer. What does scaling look like from there? Because right, the really hard job of a startup founder is keep improving your product, keep acquiring customers, try to figure out how to build your team. At what point did you court investors? Like where did the story go from there?
Yeah, so we went through a pretty long bootstrapping phase, because we kind of believe that, like, there's always this concept of an MVP when you're doing any kind of startup. We sort of believed in our space, the viable part of that was a super, super high bar. Because
Mm,
if we're trying to get our users to replace their entire tech stack and build their entire business on top of us, like it has to be reasonably good along all relevant dimensions, right? Like you can't like kind of half-ass it, right? So we sort of went with the mindset of like we weren't going to grow fast. We want to work with real customers to make sure we're going in the right direction, but we want to work with like 20 customers, right? Which is enough to make sure you're not just building for one person. It's enough to make sure you're building like a tool that can cover a lot of use cases, but it's a manageable amount. So we made the money work basically via one large customer we found that paid us to do essentially consulting work on top of our own platform to
mm,
help support them. So that paid the bills for quite a while, and then eventually we sort of reached this tipping point where the typical first question we'd always get is, can I build X on Bubble, where X is whatever the person's startup idea is. And you know generally the pattern was, we get that question, we'd say like, no, we need to add something, or no, we need to add something, and then we try and add this something or whatever. But we started noticing we're at a point where the answer started becoming, yes, actually, we have all the features you need for this, and that was like a more and more common answer as we
mm.
sort of fleshed out the product. Um, so we started shifting a little bit more into growth mode. We ended up doing a public launch on a Product Hunt, which our timing was pretty lucky. Like Product Hunt was like sort of reaching its like initial peak prominence in the startup ecosystem, right as like we decided to use it to like get published. Went super well. We were like the definitely the top of the day, and I think like the second top thing of the month or something like that.
Mm.
Got a ton of traffic, and that sort of like helped seed our ecosystem. And we basically started seeing sort of word of mouth exponential growth. Not super steep exponential growth, but like the curve had that shape.
Yeah, it's good.
Um, and over time, our revenue numbers got to the point where we were able to start hiring, starting to build the team a little bit, and we got up to 10 people without raising money, and basically looked at each other and were like, all right, this is not a 10-person idea. This is like a 100-person, 1,000-person idea,
Right.
and the rate at which we're hiring is just too slow. Like we need to pull money from the future into the present. So we went out and raised our first round of venture funding.
Got it. Got it. So yeah, I remember Product Hunt in that season. That was we launched some products there that the traffic
Hmm.
was just astronomical. It seemed like everybody in the world
Hmm.
was using
Yeah,
Product
yeah.
Hunt. Yeah, so that okay, so the challenge then of incorporating feedback from customers, going through some kind of product cycle, the background of the dev queue, fixing bugs, et cetera. Sounds like a lot of that was you were just wearing multiple hats, or you had an extremely small team at the time,
Hmm.
and so you're grinding it out. You're interacting with people in the New York startup scene, and just is that largely where even before the Product Hunt, kind of how you were acquiring those early customers?
Yeah, yeah. Our first set of customers were basically in person. We found them person by person in the New York startup scene. We started building a little bit of a web presence, and then we started doing something which worked tremendously well for us. We set up this discourse discussion forum. Just the simple like pieces of software people could like chat with each other, and at the time, Emmanuel was handling sort of like our support at Bubble email. So when people would write in with a question, he'd like reply with an answer. And what he started doing is he started telling people, you know what, if you post that question on the forum, I'll answer you there. So the customer would go like, fine. So they'd like copy paste their email onto the discussion forum, and then Emmanuel would like rush over and like write a really good answer to it. So he kept on doing this. And then what we started noticing is people started answering each other's questions. database.
Yeah.
And that's kind of when the sort of word of mouth community growth started taking off,
Mm.
because you start to get a snowball effect where people started like developing relationships with each other and becoming friends and helping each other out and giving each other coaching on like how to use Bubble, coaching on their business ideas, and like sort of like started this like community of entrepreneurs and builders that, I mean, I think that community, became in a large part like the early no code community, and it just started, taking off.
So let's talk more about no code. I think we've got this far in the conversation without actually describing really in detail what is Bubble. So, can you talk about no code and specifically what Bubble did at the time and does now from a feature perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think no code is like one of those really hard words to define. I mean, like the fact that like it's expressed as a negative kind of tells you that like it's one of these things that's hard to put a pin in.
Mm.
What no code means to us is replacing the traditional engineering team with tools that let people without that much technical training use them. So Bubble is geared for someone who is comfortable with computers. Like it's not for someone, it's not for, grandma who gets scared when you push a button on the keyboard and like it makes a weird beeping noise. But you don't have to have like written any code. You don't have to know anything about programming. And it's designed to be learnable by someone with that general profile in a few hours to like a couple days, basically. Um, so we think of Bubble as a programming language, and I think if
Mm.
other no code tools do not think of themselves that way, like they think of themselves as like a complete replacement for programming altogether. But we see ourselves as a programming tool.
Mm.
Um, but we see it as making the like if you think about what programming is, it's like expressing an idea to a computer, right? It's like saying like, hey, you want computer to do X, I want to tell that computer how to do it. Coding is kind of writing in a language that's convenient for the computer. No code in our minds is about the computer giving you a user interface that's convenient for you. Like, what is the simplest, clearest way of expressing what you're trying to create? So, if you're building a user interface, you kind of want to draw it, right? User interfaces are visual. So you shouldn't be, writing words to describe your user interface. You should just be drawing it, right? And if you're trying to do a business flow, it should look like a flow. Like, the user clicks here and then X happens and then Y happens. It should sort of be structured like that. So that's sort of the philosophy of Bubble. I guess in terms of what it does, right? It's a web application builder, and I say web application, not web page, because we're specifically talking about things with like databases and like that can do transactions and that can be really, really customized. Like our product, True North, was being able to clone Kickstarter or Airbnb using Bubble, right? Both extremely sophisticated applications, not the kind of thing you could ever build on like, like a Squarespace or a Weebly or a Wix. It'd just be totally impossible. So that's kind of the way we sort of defined Bubble initially.
And then where does it evolve from there? Is there all kinds of integrations, and what's an example of a type of a complex application that can be built on Bubble today?
Yeah. So Bubble talks to basically everything at this point. Like pretty much any popular service, we have sort of like a one-click install plugin in our ecosystem. And in terms of what you can build, sky's basically the limit. So the the hard restrictions are the output is a website, right? And there are ways of like turning a bubble built website into a mobile application like for the app store, but we don't provide a ton of support for that today. So like users do it, but it's not in our sweet spot. So it has to be basically a website. um you can't do super custom graphics within Bubble. Like if you're trying to make like a side-scrolling video game, Bubble's just probably not the best platform to use. It sort of works better with more like sort of form user interaction elements like buttons, inputs, lists, like the kind of things you sort of find on like a lot of interactive like web applications, news feeds, that kind of thing. Um, but within those constraints, you can do pretty much anything that you'd want. You could build a Facebook clone, you could build a Twitter clone, you could, build an Uber clone. There's a lot you can do within that.
So yeah, so I'm actually about for Uber. So for mapping, like what sophisticated? I mean, I like the approach that you're taking. That it's essentially a programming language. That it's a set of tools, set of commands, set of libraries that developers that are developing on Bubble can get more stuff done. So yeah, I'm curious to learn a little bit more about mapping. What kind of mapping features are available for developers on Bubble?
Yeah. So the way we kind of approach stuff like that is we find the best of breed service and integrate with it. So we use Google Maps as our mapping tool, and we've built a Google Maps implementation that exposes a lot of like the lower level stuff. So you can populate the map with markers. You can work with basically any of the levers or controls that you'd want to do with it. And the Bubble philosophy is like if you need a specific component like that, we try and provide it to you. But even if we don't provide it to you, you can always extend Bubble by, having, an engineer write a new Bubble plugin that like snaps into Bubble basically to sort of add that functionality.
Ah, interesting. Okay, so like if I wanted to work with, Google has like a million different APIs. So if I wanted to work with one of their niche APIs, um, how would I how would I include it in it? Right. I mean, I've personally been building web applications since, or I don't know, 2004, 2005.
Mhm.
I got really into Rails 2005, 2006, built a Rails hosting company, kind of helped developers
Mhm.
all around the world kind of do their thing. And I remember when single page apps kind of became a thing, and then the wars between Angular and Ember, and then React kind of came on the scene, and
Mhm.
you know everybody's sort of figuring out how to build these more sophisticated web applications. So what is the process like if you wanted to create something highly customizable? Is it kind of like React Native, where you can do your own thing and then plug it in, or like how do developers approach it that are maybe more sophisticated web developers?
Yeah. So if you're already a programmer, there's basically uh, like three or four different ways you can engage to extend Bubble's functionality. So one is you can create what we call an element, which is basically a visual thing on the page. So if you've ever worked in any system with components like React, for instance, like you're sort of familiar with the idea of like a component as like a self-contained visual element that like can bind to data and sits on a web page as part of the larger flow. So you can basically write your own custom components in JavaScript. Another way you can engage is we have this thing called actions, which are basically like in a bubble workflow what happens. So when a user interacts with the page, you can kick off a sequence of actions. And again, you can write custom actions in JavaScript, and we'll actually run it server side for you, like using AWS Lambda to kind of sandbox it and let you basically write custom server side code. Um, the other things you can do is Bubble exposes APIs. So there's like a one click, like, here, all your Bubble data is available via an API. You can also build more custom APIs that are like tied to Bubble's workflow systems.
Mm.
So if you want to get in at Bubble from external code, you can do that. And then Bubble also works the other way around. So you can consume APIs. Bubble has a no code API connection tool that basically lets you just, copy in the URL of your API, set the configuration parameters. It'll hit it, get some sample data back, and then you sort of map that data into Bubble. And then you can work with, an external data source in Bubble as if it were native Bubble data.
Oh wow, yeah, that's cool. That's great. So, all right. So then, as you've grown, I'd imagine there are a number of stories of entrepreneurs that have built on Bubble. Would you mind sharing one or two or three that sort of exemplify that the time and cost savings that entrepreneurs can have by building on Bubble?
Yeah, definitely. Well, so one story I like is one of our users, Nate, started this app called Coins. I think it's been funded to the tune of at least 1 million. I think they might have done another round more than 1 million recently. And Nate, I believe, started as like a manager of like a fast food company, and well, no like web industry stuff. Stumbled on Bubble, like sort of turned himself into a software developer using Bubble.
Mm,
Started out like as like a Bubble consultant, like just like building stuff for other people,
mm,
and just making money like that, and then got recruited to be the sort of technical co-founder for Coins as like a Bubble developer, and then like built a successful startup. So kind of I like that story because it sort of illustrates the career impact that Bubble has on a lot of its users. Like people make jumps into the tech industry that like you can do without Bubble, right? Like there's always stories of people like teaching themselves how to code and transitioning, but we make that jump a lot smaller. Like it's just much less of a leap for people to sort of reinvent themselves like that. Another story that sort of illustrates like the business power of Bubble as a tool is one of our earliest customers, and one of the ones that like got biggest actually, is this company called Dividend Finance. It's a solar loan company. They basically make money by like originating loans to homeowners who want to buy solar panels. It's a cool business model.
cool.
And were basically they were like a funded startup, didn't really have that much of a tech team initially. They were sort of relying on this like sort of outsourced crowdfunding portal builder tool, because they initially thought they were going to be like a crowdfunding thing and that they needed some software to help process the loans. And they lined up a bunch of partnerships with solar panel installers because that's how they find customers. And they were getting increasingly close to like launching with those solar panel installers. And as they're having those conversations with them, they realized that like there's actually like a huge gap in their software offering. They basically needed like a tool that the installers could use that almost like was like a CRM for tracking every single solar deal, and then like walking the loan through the approval process, like have the customer enter their information, have it get sent to the back end where the loan gets approved, and do this. And they're on their way to market and realize like, holy, smokes, like we don't have a tech platform. We need one. Like we're learning from our customers that like there's a gap here in our
Mm,
business model where like tech needs to go. um it's, I think this was in the early summer, late spring, and the launch was planned for fall. And they were like, "Wow, like if we try and like start recruiting engineers, build up a tech team, build a V1 of this, like that's not going to happen over the summer." Um, One of the people on the team was a Bubble user and had just been using us for side projects, and basically went to their CEO and said, like, "You know what? Like, there's this new thing called Bubble. Um, give this a whirl." And they ended up meeting with us. I mentioned earlier that we had one customer that sort of paid for our early days of bootstrapping. This was the customer. And we basically made a deal with them where the guy on their team would build the Bubble app, and then we would build features into Bubble as he needed them.
Ah,
So, he'd be building the app, and we were like rushing behind him or right in front of him, building the features he was about to
right.
need for his application. And
Awesome.
basically, one person over the course of the summer went from nothing to a pretty sophisticated, CRM plus loan origination platform that integrated with Salesforce for some of like the back end functionality. They went live. Business like skyrocketed. Like they did very well as a company. And it worked. Like they were able to get off the ground in a way that with traditional code just wouldn't have been agile enough to like a get the platform out there, and then b every time they needed to add a new installer, they had like 30 new features, because like each installer had a different workflow and a different process, and they need to accommodate them to win those deals. And the ability to just like add features on the fly using no code to just like quickly change around the product allowed them to just keep on adding new customers and sustain that trajectory.
That's amazing. Yeah, no, those are cool stories. I mean, a lot of questions from those. The first one would be the community of no code developers, people that are bubble consultants. How do you find one? Like, is there a marketplace? Do you have preferred? Do you just go search on the internet? Like, how, if somebody wanted to
Mhm.
find a bubble consultant to help them build something, how would they go about doing that?
Yeah. So to be perfectly frank, like we probably need to put some more love into this space than we have to date.
Mm,
Like this is one of the areas I think that I'd like to see us improve on over the next year or two, which is like doing a better job sort of like curating that experience.
mm.
But today, like we have, if you go to the agencies page of our website, we have a list of a bunch of known bubble agencies that we've done really some degree of quality control on. We haven't necessarily done like deep checks on them. So that's one way of finding people, and then our community discussion forums is another way of finding people. Like there's a lot of like posts like I'm looking for a developer, and then someone will end up answering them.
So I've been angel investing for over 10 years now. I'm curious to get in the heads of the people who invested in the company that you mentioned earlier, right? Where you said he raised 1 million or so. Because obviously one of my questions from a tech diligence standpoint would be like, can you scale with Bubble? Like, how far can you go? Can you turn this into a 50, 100, $1 billion exit? At what point do we need to come off Bubble? I'm sure that's a huge conversation. So I'm just curious, how were investors thinking about it? How do you approach the general conversation about how far can you scale with Bubble?
Yeah, so this is obviously a big question that our customers have, and our answer is couple fold. So one is our goal is to let you scale all the way. Like we are not explicitly saying like bubble takes you here and then you jump off. Like our goal is to actually take you for the entire ride. From a features and functionality perspective, we're basically there. Like Bubble, as describing the way various ways bubbles could be extended. Bubble's open ended enough right now that people don't hit hard feature and functionality dead ends. And for like really big successful company customers of ours, like they'll often have like sort of a mixed bubble and tech solution where like if they have to do like special custom development, they have an engineering team that builds that and then they integrate it with bubble, whereas bubble like provides their overall business flow and user experience. So sort of this hybrid bubble tech model, like from a feature and functionality perspective, is very scalable. The area we're working on today is basically performance at scale, and I would give us basically a C plus B minus there. Like we've had customers scale up to pretty huge business volumes on top of our platform, but we do have customers run into like performance issues as they grow, and we're basically spending our engineering time like working with our top customers, seeing what bottlenecks they're hitting, and basically updating the platform to kind of solve those bottlenecks. Um, the good news about that is when we fix a performance problem for one customer, because it's a platform, all the other customers, sort of get that fix, right? Whereas if you build out your own engineering team, you're solving all the scaling challenges that every single other startup has gone through. Whereas we're kind of trying to solve them one more time for everyone in sort of like a final set of you know scaling logic and code to that can then be rolled out to all our customers.
Yeah, it's fascinating listening to you. Is that I love sort of the meta nature. Again, that word meta is that being from Seattle, well,
Mhm.
most of my tech friends either work for Microsoft or they worked for Amazon. And I remember
Yep.
the very early days of Amazon Web Services. Their stories were actually very similar to what you're describing, where their earliest customers on AWS, they kept they kept building more services. They worked with the largest customer, like Netflix, for example. A lot of the features and things that AWS provides for people is because Netflix needed to scale with AWS, and it sounds like you have an analogous customers. Is that kind of like what has taken you to the next level for Bubble the last couple of years?
Yeah, very much so. It's our sort of most successful customers raising the bar on our service. And I love that you bring up AWS because it's a company we look at a lot. Like we think strategically what we're trying to do is very similar to the trajectory that AWS followed.
Yeah, no, that's cool. So, all right, so you recently had just a huge fundraising round. It's public information. You raised $100 million. That you obviously captivated the hearts and minds of investors for the future of Bubble. Where are you heading? Like, what's the grand vision?
Yeah. So our sort of 3 to 5 year goal is if you're a tech entrepreneur and you go in and pitch a venture capitalist today, they're going to ask you, okay, who's your engineers, right? We're trying to make it so when you have that conversation, the question is, wait, why do you have engineers? Like, what are you doing that's so unique and different that requires engineers?
Yeah.
Um, so that's kind of the lever we're trying to flip with this fundraise, basically going from a world where engineering is the default for startups to a world where engineering is the exception. Like maybe you're doing like some really sophisticated machine learning algorithm, you build that with your own engineering team, and then you build the user interface on Bubble, right? That's the world we're going towards.
Yeah, amazing, amazing. So, okay, so then the topic of mobile, you said you light support for there's all these sort of view libraries and different ways skins. I know in the last 10 years the various iconic frameworks, etc., Titanium, that have the ability to pull in a web app. But what is your advice for people who really need the mobile app? But I'm going to put a little asterisk next to it because I actually think the future may be moving away from native, obviously getting all the the progressive web apps, etc., etc. So I guess that's kind of like a multi-part question. But yeah, I'm curious how you approach this dialogue.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like we went through a point, like maybe like 3 or 4 years into Bubble, where we were looking at each other and saying, like, did we make a huge mistake by not starting with native mobile?
Mm,
And today, I don't feel like any regrets about that
mm,
decision because I think there was sort of like a peak, and then I think they'll realize that like there's only so many apps people want on their phones, right? Like you don't need an app to stay at a hotel for a night, even though like hotels at one point thought they needed to give you an app, right? Um, so I think there was like kind of a peak, and we're seeing stuff like progressive web apps and just web apps in general kind of replace a lot of that demand. That said, native mobile is still very real, and it's still one of the bigger asks we get from our community. Like, our users would love us to come out with like sort of an end-to-end package solution here. In the interim, there's a few different options in the space for users. So one is Bubble does build sort of native friendly web applications. So they're responsive. They'll scale down to your phone. You can do all the design elements in Bubble. And there's various third party tools for taking a responsive application and wrapping it in sort of a mobile wrapper so that you can publish it on the App Store. And we actually have someone on our team right now doing like an updated pass of the market and doing a bunch of research to see like what are the best tools, and we plan to publish a blog post on this probably the next month or so with our recommendations. So I'm not going to give you recommendations now because we're sort of redoing the research to see what like as of 2021 what the best options there are. So that's one general direction. Another thing we see with our users is they'll build their like web application in Bubble. They'll use Bubble to expose an API, and then they'll use some other tool to build a native app using the Bubble API to back the native app. So using Bubble for the database and for the web app, and then something else for the native app. And then finally, there are much as I hate to admit it, non-Bubble no code tools out there. Some of them that are focused on mobile specifically. I don't think any of those tools have quite gotten to the back end sophistication that we have. So I don't usually push users that way just because if their use case gets above a certain level of complexity, I don't think that'll end up working.
yeah.
But for some simpler mobile applications, there's other players out there that are also options. So that's kind of the landscape for people wanting a no code mobile solution.
Okay, so you hinted at that there probably is at some point a bubble native end to end sort of thing coming. Is that true?
Yeah, it's been 2 years away for the last 5 years, so
Okay.
so
Yeah.
I'm a little hesitant to put a
Right.
timeline on it.
Sure.
What we're thinking about right now is there's so much to do with our current web app product that we're just super excited about, that we're a little worried about splitting focus and spinning up a new product, but there's going to be a point in time where we want to do it, because I do think long term, you know, even with native mobile apps are peaking and declining, I think there's going to be a steady state where there will continue to be a need for them.
Got it. Got it. So, as a web developer myself, as I mentioned, a lot of building applications is identity and permissions, right? Is both
Yep.
the authentication and authorization around the application. So, you mentioned Bubble is sort of a programming language or framework in and of itself. How do you handle complex permissions? Certain people can see certain views or not. Is that a very complex DSL that people have to, domain state language that people have to learn, or um, is that something that is easier or harder depending on what you're doing? Just curious how you approach that.
Yeah. So we have this uh, feature set called privacy rules, basically, where it's sort of like a declarative way of saying, like, all right, like you can basically write a rule like, this project, if the project's owner is the current user or the project's owner is in group X, then you should be able to have, read permissions and write permissions on it. So it's kind of a framework for sort of just like laying out those rules and using the ball philosophy of, like, clearly human expressible concepts and terms, basically.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, because I was deep in the Rails community, and there was a gem called Can that turned into
Hmm.
Can that basically had our ability file, right, where you had to explicitly declare that so and so can access so and so. So in Bubble, is there analogous sort of files that have like key value, and you just sort of fill them all up, or is it what is the interface like when you're actually in the weeds developing?
Yeah, yeah. So it's basically we go so Bubble basically has like a type of thing with sort of our data type, right, or database table if you're coming at from a programming point of view. So for each one of these, like if you have, like, users, projects, tasks, right, or whatever your app is about, right. So you'd go to users, and then you can basically say, all right, first of all, is this public? Like, should everyone be able to see this? All right. If not, all right, restrict all the permissions from the public. And then you can say, like, let's just add reasons why someone should be able to see it. So one reason someone might be able to see this data is if they're friends with this user, right? So you
Mm,
add a rule that says if this person is friends, you can see it, right?
mm.
And then another reason they might be able to see it is if this user has, like, opted in to make their profile public. So if, users profile public is set, make these fields public, basically.
Mm.
So you kind of like go data type by data type and just sort of like spell out how you want it to behave. So I guess there's definitely analogies to,
Hmm.
the Rails, version of this, right? But we're trying to make it, as intuitive and expressed in terms of the concrete things that the user would understand.
Yeah, no, that's great. So probably another common question you get is around, like, if people want to jump ship or build a much more complex ecosystem, can they export their data? How do they? Is that something, is that something they get locked into, or how do you approach that with the community?
Yeah. So I would say, like, to be honest, Bubble's lock-in is fairly high, because if you build an app in Bubble, there's no like magic click a button and then you have like source code that you just go and run somewhere else. And that's kind of a function of the way Bubble works behind the scenes. Like we wanted to build it in a way that was very easy for us to evolve over time.
Sure.
And as soon as you start like spitting out code, it really locks you into like how you can evolve it. So we sort of made the decision like honestly, from a business point of view, I'd rather there be less lock in rather than more lock in because
Hmm.
it makes it easier to get new customers when you tell them there's not too much lock-in. But from a technical point of view, we decided to sort of bite the bullet there and make it so there's no like an easy click to export the code. What we do let you do is, you can dump all your data. So, we can spit
Sure.
out in CSV, JSON, whatever. And we'll let you dump the Bubble app in the format we store it. So we store it as this giant JSON document. You can't really go from that to code directly or automatically, but at least you have all the information and all the data so that you can take it to a team of engineers and start working on porting it.
Got it. Got it. Yeah. Oh, I hadn't even actually thought about exporting code. I mean, like that would be next level. I suppose you probably get that question a lot. But can you
Yeah,
just
we
magically
definitely get
make
the question.
an MVC or a Rails or a Python or some code for me? Uh,
Mhm.
yeah. So I mean, I guess the overall concept, as you've been describing it, I've been thinking about what is it, Jarvis with Iron Man. You just sort of talk to the computer, and the computer just does all the stuff for you.
Mhm.
Uh, and I love the overall vision that you have, that you're trying to flip the switch so
Mhm.
that it's like, why do you need engineers?
Right.
That's powerful. So how are you then interacting with entrepreneurial communities? Obviously, as we talked a little bit before this, I run a operator investor group where we are investing in the earliest stages of venture building. I I I want to be able to say the exact same thing to the founders that we work with. Like, why do you need a full tech build? Why not why not just use Bubble? So like, how are you engaging with the entrepreneurial community? It sounds like there's a number of different things that I've heard that you've been up to. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, we love sort of existing entrepreneurial communities because that's our people, right? Like that's how we sort of got started. That's what we believe in. So we're pretty open and willing to help. We've done a number of different things with different groups over time, and we're generally pretty flexible. But like things we've done in the past, like giving Bubble workshops to the entrepreneurial community, or running like a Bubble boot camp where we have an instructor sort of like teach people end to end through learning how to code. We've done things like given Bubble discounts to startup groups to make it easier to get ideas off the ground. So we engage in a variety of ways, but generally, if there's a group that's sort of like committed to entrepreneurship, we're generally happy to take that call and work with them to see how we can help.
That's cool. Yeah, because we work with a lot of universities that they're cranking out entrepreneurship programs. A lot of co-incubate things with different incubators or pre-accelerator programs out there. And it definitely, as you and I were talking, it feels like not enough people. They may know the concept of no code, low code, but
Hmm.
I don't think people understand how real it is.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, obviously, I'm a big fan. Help you get the word out. I'm going to get more of our entrepreneurs onto Bubble. But is there anything is there anything that you want to say to the world, to the entrepreneurs listening in, the investors listening in? You've been in this conversation for a long time, but is there anything we haven't talked about yet that you want to make sure to share with the audience?
Yeah. I think there's a couple of things I'd emphasize. Like the answer to the sort of overarching question of can I do this? Can I figure this out? Is there a way to make it happen? Is generally yes these
Mhm.
days, right? Both no code in general and Bubble in particular. The state of the art has advanced a lot, and I don't think startup culture has caught up with it yet. I think there's still a lag because like for so many years, startup culture was kind of oriented around engineering, right? Like there's the,
Yeah.
first there was ninja engineers, then people stopped calling people ninjas because they realized everyone was calling them ninjas and didn't mean anything anymore. Then there's like 10x engineers, like there's all this, Y Combinator, like focus on like, hiring the smartest engineers. Like been that's been in the sort of the water for so long that I think it takes a little while for the message to trickle through to say like, really, you can do a lot of what you're trying to do, maybe all of what you're trying to do, without really that much technical sophistication these days, because the state of the art of tools have just advanced so much,
Mm,
right? So I think that's a big message I'd want to communicate. And then the second message I'd want to communicate is the button, and the but is there's still a learning curve for all of this stuff, right? Like we lose some people on Bubble because they show up kind of expecting the like magical experience, when what we deliver is the, hey, this takes some work, but then you can do cool things experience,
right.
right? Um, and there are definitely people out there who are brilliant entrepreneurs and who have great ideas, who are not tinkerers at heart, who don't like sitting in front of a computer saying like, hey, maybe this should be here instead of here, and maybe the UX flow should be this instead of this, and maybe when I click this button, something else should happen. And what I'd say to those people is, great, right? Like find a partner to help you create it, right? Like, whether or not you're using no code or, or not, like there's a lot of what no code does is it lowers the cost of finding that partnership, right? Like it means instead of having to like find a super rare, super expensive engineer, you can find, sort of another entrepreneur who does have that sort of hands-on desire. So those are, I think, the two big takeaways I'd like people to hear. It's super possible without engineering help these days, but it does require learning and getting a little hands-on and digging. And you can want to do that, or you can find a friend who wants to do that.
So obviously Figma has taken the world by storm in the UX world. Most UI UX people I know are building on Figma. Are there integrations, or like how would somebody who's building on Figma kind of bring that into a bubble environment? Do you have advice there?
Yeah, so we actually built a Figma integration, I think a year back or so.
Oh, cool.
Um, and the way it works is you basically just connect your Bubble account to your Figma account and click the import button, and it translates Figma into Bubble. And usually there's some cleanup work because they're
Sure.
communicating different things. Like Figma's communicating design, Bubble's communicating layout and business logic. So usually, you have to do some work to like tweak it into like behaving the way you want it to behave, but it saves you a lot of the initial, porting things over cost.
That's incredible. That's incredible. All right. So what we're going to do, I think this is a good place to stop. I definitely want to collect feedback from those listening, those watching. Feel free to reach out. Josh, how can people get a hold of you?
Yeah. To get in touch with Bubble in general, just drop us a line at support@bubble.io. That's probably the fastest way to get help from us. Like we
Hmm.
have a team that'll be on top of it and can coach you. Can answer questions about like can Bubble do this? What's the best way of getting started with Bubble, etc.
Awesome. Yeah. And anybody out there can email me, just will@wclittle.com. We can collect questions and maybe we can do a follow up part two. I know people are probably curious about a demo and different things. I'm going to get in there and probably help some students because I've been teaching people to code. And, I have this little series where I've been teaching people Rails code just because I've been building Rails since 2005. Uh, and I've been teaching them like how to use Rails for both their new Hotwire stack and with the Redux React. But it's a lot of work. Like it's a lot.
Right.
You really have to be, engineering mindset cranking out. So I want to just have a bubble, and I love the fact that you approach it as essentially a programming language or programming paradigm, because then I want to kind of compare it to what we've been doing over on the Hotwire side. So I'm assuming all the like socket connections and like responsive, is that all things that are easily done in Bubble as well?
Yeah, Bubble is real time out of the box. So, data will just show up in your front end, and that just happens totally automatically.
Yeah.
Responsive, basically, our paradigm is you sort of draw it for desktop, and then we figure out how it should behave as you shrink, and then you tell us what we got wrong, and then you start tweaking it. Though on that note, we're probably going to ship a much upgraded responsive engine sometime in the next 2 months. We've been putting a lot of work into that because we've gotten feedback that like sometimes it's a little hard to learn to how to tweak it to make it behave the way you want to. So we're releasing a new engine there in the fairly near future.
Great, great. Yeah, because the little tutorial series I have is essentially very simple chat application, but three chat applications on one page. One with sort of raw JavaScript, one with Redux React, and then
Hmm.
one with Rails Hotwire, HTML over wire stuff, and all of it with Rails on the back end. And then so then the user can like open a different browser window and have six different chats and all the things updating real time. Is that going to be easy for me to replicate in Bubble?
Yeah, that's kind of our bread and butter, honestly.
Yeah, awesome. Cool. All right. Well, I'll look forward to doing that. I'll tell everybody here about that, and then maybe we can get some questions in and get a part two later this fall or next year.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. It's been really great talking to you.
Yeah, likewise. Really appreciate it. Thank you. All right, a couple quick things before you go. Number one, I have a general newsletter where I write about technology and startups and health science and teaching people to code. And I write about a variety of different subjects that we talk about on this show. So if you go to wclittle.com, there you'll be able to subscribe, and you'll also be able to subscribe to particular topics. If you're just interested in one or a few of them, you'll be notified right when I publish new content in those areas. Number two, my partners and I at Proto Ventures have a portfolio company called Startup Rocket. If you go to startuprocket.com, there you'll be able to receive coaching guides and customize an operations framework for you and your team and your advisors to be on the same page in terms of what is the appropriate next step for you and your entrepreneurial journey. And finally, if you wouldn't mind leaving a review anywhere that you have listened to this podcast or watched this podcast, it'd be super helpful to help those who might be interested in consuming this content as well. Thank you.